At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? My special guest today is Sir Harry Studholme, a former Forestry Commission Chairman, Honorary Treasurer of the Devon County Agricultural Association, and Chair to Treeconomics Limited, a service which helps to promote the many virtues of trees in our towns and cities. Harry has a special interest in how trees, forests, and our care of them evolved, and in this episode we go back in time to discover what forests were like before human beings were around, and what that might teach us about today and the future. I sat down with Harry for a coffee at his home on the Perridge estate to pick his brains about all things trees. Harry, a big thanks for meeting with me and welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. It's really nice to speak to you. I feel like we're going to go on a lot of side branches in our conversation, but we're first going to start with the question, what do trees mean to you?
Thanks for asking me that question, which I've been asked occasionally and always struggle to answer. It's like asking, what does bread or water mean to you? Trees are the stuff of the landscape. They're the world around me. I can't remember a time before I lived in a wood, and it's less the individual trees than the forests that I have a feeling of connection with. There are a few specific trees that I love and that can remember, but it's the sort of the sense of the soil and the noise of the birds and the feel of the wind on one's face. It's a multi-sensory environment. The feel, the smell, the hearing of it. My family have lived in this wood I'm the fourth generation, and my children the fifth, and so it's just around me.
And where did that begin for you? So are there any really early memories that you think those relationships with the forest and the living landscape were forged?
Well, it's through play in the woods, building dens and dams on the streams. And I can remember at school, there was a person who looked after the forestry. He was influential on my life, perhaps. And my father, my grandfather, it's an environment as much as a single event.
So it definitely sounds like that's an appreciation that was passed down in a way and nurtured by a whole group of people around you.
Yeah, that would be true. Yes.
And so from that point then, when did you start to think you wanted to work with trees? Because it's not always the most lucrative industry to come into. What was it that sparked that interest?
I think trees found me rather than me finding trees. I had a career as an accountant, as a manager of organizations, and my parents died, and my father had spent his life building up a forest, and I inherited the forest. It's as simple as that, really.
Can you tell us a little bit about the forests and the trees that you have on your estate, and perhaps paint a bit of a picture of what have you got here?
Well, it's a mixed forest. It's a piece of land that's probably been managed for trees for several thousand years, I would imagine. There's a fort in it, which there's a nearby village called Dunchiddock, which means fort in a wood. And I suspect that people who manage the farmland and manage the woods have been doing it for a long time. And I know that when my great-grandfather came here, there was already a forest that was being managed, and it's been managed consistently in line with the fashions and the interests of the time. So the coppice woods gradually moved into oak high forest and the increasing levels of diversification into coniferous woodland. My father was part of the process after the Second World War to put more conifers into the wood. I think my grandfather put in more oaks between the First and the Second World Wars. It's been an evolving forest. I planted a mixture of things over the years, and mostly now I'm looking to see how I can adapt the forest to a changing climate in the future.
Harry, you've had a really rich kind of working history with trees, forests and land management. And I know that a large part of that was spent working for the Forestry Commission. And not all of our listeners might know what FC does or is. Maybe you can just give us a brief history of where did it begin? What was its origins? Where's it come to now? And actually, what's its relevance today?
It's deeply unfashionable probably to say that the roots of the Forestry Commission lay in probably amateur science in British India, that there was a kind of resurgence of interest in how to protect the forests of India and how to manage them, which led to the Indian Forest Service. And at the same time, there was an awful lot of interest in managing trees in Britain because of a serious downturn. The forest level dropped to a few percentage points of the landscape. After agriculture slumped in the 1870s because of the opening up of global markets, forestry became an alternative land use, which was increasing interest at the end of the 19th century. When the First World War occurred, we discovered we hadn't got any timber. And coming out of that was an idea that we suddenly had to start to plant trees again. And the Forestry Commission came out of both the ideas that were kind of nascent before the First World War, but also the sense of crisis of the First World War. And that grew to planting, very heavy planting after the First World War and then the Second World War, because during those wars, we heavily cut off woods. And we knew we needed to sort of recover from that wartime experience.
And then scrolling forward to right now then, has the role of the FC changed? And what do you think its place is today?
It's got a really important place today because trees are, because of their timescales and because they're so easily taken for granted, they're very easily misunderstood. And so to have a body which concentrates expertise in trees and is supported by government forest research, which is a tremendous body that understands and maintains within itself, people who have knowledge of papers that have been written over very long periods of time, while at the same time in touch with the community of forest researchers worldwide, linked to the practical experience of managing forests. And now the Forestry Commission has a vast estate. It's one of the biggest landowners in Britain, providing public access. And that multidimensional aspect of forestry held within the Forestry Commission, I think, gives a depth and a breadth of forest knowledge that wouldn't be available if it wasn't concentrated in one government body.
And the role of a forester traditionally has always been to think a few generations ahead, and often the work that a forester or woodland manager might do is likely going to benefit people in future generations. And there's a lot of focus on at the moment about how the human future is threatened, perhaps how that's interrelated with trees and our management of natural resources. So relative to when you learned to be a forester, do you think the challenges today are different? And what do you think makes a good forester in 2024?
I think what makes a good forester hasn't changed. I think the ability to look forwards, think of the future, and to look at detail. It is about looking, it's about understanding detail, and it's about understanding the complexity of forest. Forest is not just, one thing. Bad forestry is thinking of it in very simplistic terms. I think what makes a good forester probably hasn't changed. So there's some of the fashions in forestry have changed. Here we manage on a closer to nature basis, a CCF basis. So we don't clear fell unless we have to. We use a lot of natural regeneration. We're continuously increasing the carbon sink on the estate. And we are adapting the forest and looking forwards. And I think that is, what makes a good forester these days.
And you've really sort of been able to observe the introduction of the environmental movement and its influence on land management and forestry in particular. What are your personal reflections on how that might have changed practices or thinking? And again, where are we now with that?
Well, that's an incredibly multi-layered question. I think the first thing to point out is, I think the word environmentalist is a political word. you, I, environmentalists. I think there are many people who would like to be an environmentalist because it makes them feel good to describe themselves as that. But it's not about managing the landscape. It's not about understanding the detailed problems of how we solve where we are and where we're going. It's much more about sort of waving your arms and saying, I'm about it. The growth of the environmental movement is old. I mean, it's not a new thing. It's been emerging, and different people have badged themselves in different ways as environmentalists. I think within the environmental movement, there are people with different perspectives, some of which I don't think are good for handling the climate issues that we face now and managing the environment and dealing with the biodiversity issues that we have now. I think that some of them can be misinformed, that they don't understand the history of the landscape, the logic behind the landscape, and how it interfaces with human beings. But, they're people that care, and I think we just need all to work together to try to solve the mess that we're in now.
Thanks, Harry. And we'll come back to people and perhaps economics a bit later in our chat. And from thinking about the future, I'd like to now get in a time machine and go way, way back, because part of the reason I really wanted to speak to you today was that I heard a recent talk you did for the Arb Association, and it was really fascinating to hear the research you've done into where forests began, actually, and how they evolved with planet Earth and its many epochs and changes. So where did your fascination for the prehistoric begin? What led you to that?
I think I'm just interested in the sort of logic behind the landscape. There was a really wonderful academic and writer, W.G. Hoskins, who came from around here, who put it beautifully, who said the logic that lies behind the beautiful whole. And I think I've always been hunting for that. Because when you make decisions, you need to understand the why you're making decisions. I mean, what's extraordinary about this particular forest is there is a clear divide between the red soils, which are later than most of the forests. The red soils tend to be farmland. The earlier soils, the sort of brown soils, are carboniferous. They're between sort of 300 and 350 million years old. And then the red soils are Permian, which are younger. They're more like 250 to 300 million years old. And they have very different characteristics. And the reason that they're here is we lie on a boundary between two vast continents that crushed together approximately 300 million years ago. And so, that's driving the landscape now. And so that's always that logic behind how it's laid out. And that's one of many factors in how it's come to where it is now.
So I imagine a lot of people listening to this would have seen Back to the Future. And if I had that time machine, that flux capacitor, I'd be getting in it and going to see what happened with trees. Where did they emerge from? And knowing the depth of knowledge you've got in this subject area, I wonder, Harry, if you might take us on a bit of a interglacial safari, if you like, to stop at some of those key epochs in time where we can really sort of better understand where trees have come from. Would you be up for that?
I can try. I can try. So the first, if you were to stop at the beginning, obviously the planet is 4.5 billion years old. So we're starting quite late in the planet's life. But to go back about 400 odd million years ago, the two periods around that, the Silurian and the Devonian, were the periods in which trees first developed. So trees, and actually everything in life, started probably in the water. And over a 90 million year period, trees moved from being sort of very low level, non-vascular things like the mosses and the liverworts and the things that sort of lie on the ground. They developed a vascular system and they grew tall and developed wood and leaves, and they developed methods of interacting with the air and the cuticle and a stomata, and which allows them to interact. And the consequence of that was that they were able to develop forests. The first forests were lay around water because their reproductive systems depended on water. And about 380 odd million years ago, we had the first forests. There's been some research recently that says there were some in North Devon, but I haven't looked at that in detail. But the well-known ones of trees that looked a bit like feather dusters are in New York State. And subsequently, there were things with like Christmas trees, the Archaeopteris, that was all over the world. You can see remnants of that in fossils all over the world. And those forests, I think you would have sort of recognized them as forests, but they wouldn't have had birds. They wouldn't have had the only moving animal life in them would have been early arthropods, sort of scorpiony sort of things, and things living off the detritus on the floor. But the consequence of these forests was the reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And how much they were responsible for that is a subject of debate, and how much the roots that they developed to give them stability changed the chemical composition of the oceans is open to discussion. But it's very possible that the severe extinction that occurred at the end of the Devonian period was significantly due to the development of trees. When they re-emerged, they emerged into the Carboniferous period, which was an ice age like now, that started 360 million years ago. And the Carboniferous was a period in which there were big tropical rainforests, and we were in the tropics then. Bear in mind that the continents moved around all the time at the speed of a growing fingernail. And Britain at that time was in the tropics, and the coal fields, we know exactly what sort of trees and what they looked like because they've been preserved in the coal. So when you delve into the coal seams of South Wales, you can see exactly what, well, with a bit of cleverness, you can see what trees and forests looked like. And at that time, those forests were very quick growing. They were absorbing carbon like there was no tomorrow. There was nothing to rot. The wood, the fungi, and the insects that have developed to destroy woody structures were not there. And anyway, they fell into sort of swampy things. And the carbon, what's a terrifying thought now, is that over 40 million years, about then, 90% of the world's coal was laid down. So when you think of, we're going to run through our coal reserves in maybe a few hundred years, there's various arguments about how much reserves we have, but 40 million years worth of coal run through in 300 odd years give you an idea of the scale at which we are creating climate change. And that climate at the time was creating an ice age.
Really fascinating.
That's a sort of one period. And then you go through the dinosaurs, which were a warm period. Sea levels were quite high, and probably trees were very widely spaced because you've got creatures that are pretty much the size of several times the size of an African bull elephant rushing around, pushing the trees down. And the world stayed quite warm for over 150 million years. And at that time, sea levels were very high. And that was a time when a lot of the oil was created, because in the shallow seas, the marine creatures were falling to the ground, falling under the sea, laying down this level of oil. Well, it was turned into oil after having stuff on top of it and heated up. And again, we're burning through that in a couple of hundred years. That took about 150 million years to create. And the next stage, which I think is really fascinating, is all that time when the world was warm, we had polar forests. And some of the interest for us now is what was going on around in those forests that were far to the north of where we are now. And after the end of the dinosaurs in the great asteroid collision of 66 million years ago, the world has been cooling pretty much consistently, but with big fluctuations in between. And during that time, these forests that had evolved in the polar regions have been pushed south, and those are the basis of our forests now.
So if I understand it rightly, trees evolved and were kind of unrestricted for a time. They had lots of resources, lots of carbon dioxide, lots of water. Then later, as oxygen became more abundant and herbivores emerged as well in a direct relation to that woody and plant-based habitat, then they were brought into check a little bit more. Is that right?
That's probably a fair comment. I mean, there were very high oxygen levels during the Carboniferous, and I described that period of these coal swamps. And at that time, and shortly afterwards, herbivores started to emerge. And it's probable that the story of forests from then on was connected to the relationship between herbivores and plant cover.
And our ecology today, as we understand it, is, I guess, still a result of that long process. Where do you think we are now relative to where we've come from?
Well, the emergence of man, a million or so years ago, Homo sapiens, appeared in Europe about 40,000 years ago, has right from the beginning fundamentally changed our environment. We developed the hunting technology because we were clever, and we were very much part of the loss of large herbivorous mammals towards the end of the last ice age. So when the world warmed up again, the period of ice ages that we had that started a couple of million years ago, depending on what you define as an ice age, was a period in which the ice ebbed and flowed, and we're in what's called an interglacial. We're in a time when it's warmed up. But 100,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, it was cooling and cold. And when we lost the creatures, the big mammalian herbivores, when the world warmed up 12,000 years ago, they weren't there to hold the forests in check. So initially we had more forests than we would have had in previous interglacials. We then intervened again because we developed fire and we managed the woods through fire. And then finally in the Middle East, it was developing pretty much as the ice was melting. But in Britain, about 6,000 years ago, we started farming.
Can you just tell me what some of those herbivores that are now extinct were and what ones capture the imagination for you?
I think the things that capture all our imaginations are elephants. I mean, elephants were a product of the Miocene about 20 million or so years ago. And the elephants that we had in Britain, we had straight-tusked elephants that were wandering around the landscape until about 100,000 years ago. And those really capture my imagination, to think of where we're sitting now, there could have been elephants wandering around in Britain, changing the landscape.
At the moment, in terms of climate change, there's a real sense of panic. No one's quite sure what to do. A lot of confusion, a lot of fear, actually. And I kind of find a comfort to hearing about this deep natural history that you're talking about. And I wonder if you've come to any conclusions about what we might take from the past to apply to today.
I think the critical thing is to understand that the world is changing. I think that one of the reactions to climate change is to try to put back. There's a great sense that that we've destroyed the planet by destroying nature, and that by putting back nature, we're going to solve the problems of climate change. We're not. We are not operating on that kind of scale when we restore nature, when we rewild, or when we rear forests. It's inescapable that we have to adapt. We may work out, and I hope we do, and I feel confident we will survive what is a terrifying climate catastrophe that's going to emerge over the next 30 or 40 years. But we can only survive it if we really take it seriously. And taking it seriously does not involve putting all one's eggs in the basket of trying to recreate woods that existed 100 years ago or 200 years ago or even 10,000 years ago. I think we need to think about what the landscape might have looked like probably 10 million years ago when CO2 levels were more like where they are now or where they're heading.
Yeah, so what do you think we need to do then? If it's not about repairing what we're losing, what is it about?
Well, in forest terms, we need to experiment more. We have a real opportunity as an island where we've pretty much destroyed our kind of whatever it was that was native, and it's even more complex when you start to look at what happened during the ice ages. So we are an ideal place to experiment. We're quite far north in absolute terms. There are a lot of species from further south. We have a real opportunity to adapt our forests, and it's difficult until you've started along that road to know what the answers are. But I think we should be starting much more rapidly to be doing the experiments, to be planting things now, to enable us to survive the next 150 years.
I guess the way I see it is that the deep affection that people have for what we have now, or perhaps what we used to have in our lifetimes or a short reach ago, it's a way in 2024 of people still having that relationship with the natural world around them. But what you're saying is that whilst we need to still maintain that appreciation, we also need to perhaps zoom out and look further ahead to map out a more secure route to our survival.
I don't think that there's anything I'm saying which is detracting from the relationship with the environment. All the research gets, what people like are large trees, and they like relationships with trees and forests. The Forestry Commission, which is largely a coniferous forest, all the evidence that we had when people were wandering around it and enjoying it was that they were quite happy, that the sort of the drivers of nativeness and what's where is an intellectualized experience rather than people who are getting their hands dirty, smelling the soil, being in it. So it's perfectly possible to adapt the environment and to plant things. I mean, for instance, here, I plant a lot of tulip trees because I love tulip trees. They were here before the last ice age. They grow quickly. They're very, very beautiful. And there are other species out there. And there's nothing, it's not detracting from the environment. We've got several red list bird species here, but at the same time, we've got exotic conifers that came from the Pacific Northwest, and things like the crossbills, love them. And the coal tits and the goshawks love nesting in these things. So this sense that by changing your environment, by adapting your environment, which I think is something which we've always done. I think we've done it. We go back 10,000 years. I think we were planting oak and hazel, whether consciously or accidentally. I think we've been moving species around for as long as man has been in the landscape. So there's nothing alien about it.
What makes you think that about perhaps the hazel and the oak, and how they might have arrived here, or how abundant those species are?
Well, if you look at the pollen diagrams of where they arrived in Britain, the lighter seeded species, the species that have a wind-borne seed or producing seed young, all come in on the eastern side of the country. Oak and hazel, when you look at the pollen diagrams, and you can work out what trees were around when by digging holes in bogs and finding out what pollen existed 10, 11,000 years ago, every sign is that the oak arrived in the southwest, hazel arrived on the western side of the country. And you can, through genetics and through other routes, through looking at the type of flint tools, etc., you can see that man was migrating along a very similar route to the route that those heavy-seeded trees were moving. So there's every reason in my mind to believe that was the case. And when you look at cross-culturally, you look at the creation of agriculture about the same time, where people will move seeds around, or you look in North America about Native American people, it's a very human thing to move seeds around.
And moving on to farming then and agriculture, what's changed in that realm, and what incentives do we need at the moment to help guide us towards something sustainable?
I think there is a cultural problem that we're talking a lot. I'm listening a lot to environmentalists, and I'm also listening to farmers. In fact, I run a conference with a lot of other people called Rootstock, where we look at regenerative agriculture and work with practical farmers and researchers to talk about where we might be going with farming. And I think the missing piece in there is that the government policy is essentially, it's very difficult for government to act, but at the moment we've lost our outreach services, we've lost the research stations and the people to inform people. Unlike forestry is better in this sense than farming. We've lost the debate about how we can move farming from one place to another. There's a huge knowledge base inside farming, inside regenerative farming, which is growing. And there are, there's massive pressure from environmentalists about getting rid of the cows, etc. But there's not enough in the middle to say how we can get from one place to another.
Do you have an idea of how trees and farming best intersect at the moment?
I think it's in the detail. I think it's all too easy to kind of talk about, in grand terms about agroforestry, but what matters is practically looking at things on the ground. So here I have what I'd view as a walnut plantation, but I think is these days defined as agroforestry. I have hedges that I manage and are really useful for wildlife. Again, some people bundle that into agroforestry. I also have areas of rather poor quality plantation through which I run cattle, and they provide good shade in summer. And again, that could be viewed as agroforestry, but it's really dealing with the practical issues on the ground about how these things fit together, rather than producing these wonderful catch-all phrases. It's about practicality, observation, detailed management.
Would that be your advice to farmers nowadays then, to think in practical terms and what's there in front of them?
In terms of farming, the best farmers have been farmers who are thinking and looking at their land, relating to their land, relating to markets. So they face a very difficult set of questions, because not only are they trying to do the right thing, but they're also trying to survive. They've got to put bread on the table, they've got to keep their families together, they're looking at intergenerational issues. It's very hard to advise any individual farmer to do something unless you understand the totality of their experience.
Thanks. And going a bit deeper then into economics, and let's take a little trip into the city. And I want to know about Treeconomics, which you're a chair of. What's the concept behind that one?
Treeconomics is a very small company that grew out of Kenton Rogers' passion to bring from the United States a program called iTree, which valued trees in cities. And valuing trees in cities and understanding the role of trees in cities is really helpful to maintaining tree cover in those areas, because as we talked about already, one of the problems of trees is they are ubiquitous. There's a sense that they're there for free, whereas actually they're not. And also that they do what they do and you don't really measure it, you don't really monitor it. But in fact, they are a really important part of the urban infrastructure. So what Treeconomics does is kind of bring to the fore the management of trees in cities and their real value to the people living there.
And what are those values? What are those things we can put a price to, I guess?
Well, there's this whole natural capital debate. And I think the more fundamental things are, the harder it is to put an economic value. So, the kind of spiritual elements or the sense you can value carbon sequestration. But I don't think carbon sequestration is a big reason for planting trees in cities. You can value the pollution control because you can say what it would cost to control cities. You can value the recreational value, the shade value, etc. You can do that through talking to people. You can create these values, but it is always going to be a challenge to produce financial values for what are ephemeral. But that's true of everything. Some of the most valuable things in life are the most ephemeral, the things that are non-financial.
Do trees hold a spiritual significance for you?
Oh, it's an unfair question, really. But, in a sense, yes. Yes, I do. But I think forests more than trees. I think I have a real sense of the magic of forests. I have a real sense that from the tips of the roots leading into the mycorrhiza, through the trunk and the vascular system of the tree and the movement of nutrients around it, right up into the sky and the relationship with the sky, and all the animals and all the microbial activity. And there is something extraordinary about the complexity of it and the sense that it's part of what's been around for hundreds of millions of years, and we're all part of that.
Thank you, Harry. I love that. And thinking about the future, what would be your ideal vision in terms of trees, people, our relationship with them?
I think a lot of it is in the detail, But I think if you're planting trees, and I think the truth about forests is they need to be related, and they need to be relevant, and they need to be resilient. So I think the really important thing about forests is that they are connected with each other. The isolated forest it probably actually has massive human value as a little island, but the relationship between forests is significant. But I think the relevance is absolutely fundamental, that they need to be, if you're planting trees, because they need to be looked after, because you people actively need to decide on what a forest is going to be over time, because all our forests in Britain have been man-made, the relevance to people, and whether it's simply a recreational relevance, as whether it's a kind of extension of a garden, or whether it's a commercial relevance, or whether it's a landscape relevance, that sort of scale is important. And finally, the resilience is important, that we need to be thinking about how those forests are going to survive over the next 100 years. So we need to be thinking about the composition of those forests. And it's not simply thinking, what's the right thing for timber, but it's also the right thing for food and the species that live in it, things that produce nuts or flowers or whatever, are just as important. It's really making sure that you're trying to build an ecology that will survive into the future.
Earlier on in our chat, you spoke about the search for logic in challenging situations. Have you arrived at any kind of nuggets of truth and logic that you think might guide us?
I think the critical thing is to see the whole as well as the detail. And I think generally just to enjoy what's there as well. There's looking at the future. There's in understanding that, the present is not necessarily the same as the future, but there is a future, and it can be magic and marvelous and exciting. And to get there, you need to be understanding the logic of the landscape, the details, the soil, the water, what's changing, and how that relates to what you might put in its place. But at the same time, don't stop enjoying the look, the feel, the smell, the taste, the sound of the forest.
And a final message for our listeners, what would you like to leave them with?
Well, I think that's pretty much it. Don't stop enjoying the look, the feel, the smell, the taste, the sound of the forest.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.